This paper is about the literary construction of female authors in tribute writing by men in prose, but also and primarily in verse during the Romantic period. In particular, it's concerned with the case of Mary Lamb, familiar to all of us, of course, as the sister of Elia, the Romantic period essayist Charles Lamb, the dear friend of Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Leigh Hunt. The paper is in 3 sections. It opens with a brief recap of Mary Lamb's life and work. The second section examines representative tributes by male contemporaries. And the final section analyses in further detail tribute poems by Charles Lamb and William Wordsworth. Okay. Mary Lamb's reputation in her day was based on 2 facts. One, highly unfortunate. Lamb worked as a professional, yet poorly paid seamstress and dressmaker from the family home, where she cared for her ailing parents and had the additional responsibility of training a young female apprentice. On September the 22nd, 1796, as we know, while the family were preparing for dinner, Lamb had a manic episode, which resulted in the fatal stabbing of her mother. In its report of the event, the Morning Chronicle newspaper stated, "The young lady seized a case knife lying on the table and, in a menacing manner, pursued a little girl, her apprentice, round the room. On the eager calls of her helpless, infirm mother to forbear, she renounced her first object and with loud shrieks approached her parent. The child, by her cries, quickly brought up the landlord of the house, but too late. The dreadful scene presented to him the mother lifeless, pierced to the heart, on a chair, her daughter yet wildly standing over her with the fatal knife, and the venerable old man, her father, weeping by her side, himself bleeding at the forehead from the effects of a severe blow he received from one of the forks she had been madly hurling round the room." At the inquest of Mrs. Elizabeth Lamb, the jury returned a verdict of lunacy on her daughter, thereby releasing Mary both from the fate of execution and from a lifetime's incarceration in Bedlam, so long as there was security that she would be properly taken care of. As we all know, her brother Charles, Mary's junior by 11 years, willingly offered himself as her protector and lived with Mary until his death in 1834, aged 59, in what he described as a sort of double singleness. This drawing by the Anglo-Swiss artist Henry Fuseli, best known for his disturbing oil painting The Nightmare, is thought to be an image of Mary Lamb. As you can see, she is smiling somewhat ominously. One hand is wielding a knife, Mary Lamb's murder weapon, and the other is holding the leg of a sacrificial animal, maybe a lamb. Mary's illness recurred throughout her life, and one of the bodily signs that she was about to suffer a relapse was the appearance of an ominous smile, according to Samuel Taylor Coleridge. When Coleridge was with the Lambs in London in 1803, straying from his home and his wife Sarah in Keswick, as was his wont, he witnessed Mary about to have another attack. He wrote to Sarah of Mary that she smiled in an ominous way. On Sunday, she told her brother that she was getting bad with great agony. On Tuesday morning, and here we see an example of Coleridge acting as a responsible and capable friend, "I told Charles there was not a moment to lose. And I did not lose the moment, but went for a hackney coach and took her to the private madhouse at Hogston. She was quite calm and said it was best to do so, but she wept bitterly 2 or 3 times, yet still in a calm way. Charles is cut to the heart." The second fact about Mary Lamb is her literary achievement, notably as a collaborator with Charles on several books for children, Tales from Shakespeare, published in 1807, Mrs. Leicester's School, published in 1809, and Poetry for Children, also 1809. Lamb also wrote, under her own steam, an article entitled On Needlework, addressed as a letter to the editor of the British Ladies magazine and published in 1815 under the pseudonym Sempronia. I've written extensively, as indeed have others present today, about that article in an essay called Pattern and Romantic Creativity, published in the Bulletin in 2016. Lamb's revealing pseudonym, Sempronia, alludes to the classical figure described by the Latin historian Sallust as a woman who had committed many crimes that showed her to have the reckless daring of a man, and who could write poetry, crack a joke, and converse at will with decorum, tender feeling, or wantonness. She was, in fact, a woman of ready wit and considerable charm. The choice of such a loaded name hints at Mary's sense of wit and at a strong element of defiance in her own character. On Needlework is a bold yet carefully reasoned intervention in the hardships endured by working women, specifically women who earned their living by the needle. Directing her observations to the leisured readers of the Ladies' Magazine, Sempronia details the social deprivation of needlewomen who struggle to keep in employment, and when they do find work, they are insufficiently remunerated. She suggests that women of the higher classes who do needlework and sewing as a pastime, like me, or who continue to labour under the misapprehension that it is their moral duty to take on their sewing needs of their families, also like me, deprive professional seamstresses of trade and themselves of leisure time, which they might use to improve their minds by reading or to take a break from their household duties. I think it's interesting that Lamb's essay is published in a magazine addressed at precisely the sort of lady who might wish to wear the modish attire we can see illustrated here, or to make it for herself, indeed. Though it's worth recalling that the Ladies' Magazine was interested not just in fashion, but, as its title suggests, in literature and in women's intellectual development, as indeed Jenny Batchelor's wonderful project on the Ladies' Magazine, based at the University of Kent, has been demonstrating to us all lately. So, conscious of a distinction in men's lives between work and home, between real business and real leisure, as she puts it, which does not exist for the domestic woman, who is constantly kept busy. Even her leisure time is occupied by her work here meaning sewing work. Sempronia proposes, only if needlework were never practiced, but for a remuneration in money, might it be possible for women's lot to equal that of men, as far as respects the mere enjoyment of life. Sempronia's contention is as rational in its practicality as it is radical in its implications for the social reform of employment and leisure time between the sexes. It situates Lamb in the Enlightenment sphere of 18th century women writers such as Mary Wollstonecraft, who practiced forms of female rationality and social reform premised on sympathy. Sympathy resounds through Lamb's writing in her protest at the plight of women workers and her appeal to the sympathies of affluent women in On Needlework, and in the poems collected in her co-authored volume, Poetry for Children. Such poems as Wasps in a Garden, a lament for a drowning wasp that has been captured and is dying in a bottle trap, or Breakfast, which, as Jane Eyre puts it, describes a fly in a sugar bowl as clambering over the rocky cliffs of sweet delight, show Lamb, to quote Eyre again, entering into ways of seeing, not only of other persons, but of the least of living creatures. As with Mary Wollstonecraft's educational work for children entitled Original Stories from Real Life and subtitled Conversations Calculated to Regulate the Affections and Form the Mind to Truth and Goodness, published in 1788, Lamb's poems for children demonstrate an ethical realism that is indicative not just of moral sympathies, but of a practical reason that David Simpson argues defined the literature of women writers in the 1790s in contrast to a masculinized, self-interested intellectualism. I can't think what he means, although perhaps he means Coleridge's paradigmatic conversation poem, The Aeolian Harp of 1795, originally Effusion 35, where the poet's masculinist priorities of philosophy's eye-babbling spring lead to his arguably heretical imagining of the harp in the window as God's instrument, speaking with the voice of God. The mild reproof of his more plain-speaking wife, Sarah, brings the philosopher-poet back down to earth and returns him to her more conventional Christian faith. Mary Lamb was as much a child of the Enlightenment era, with its emphasis on sympathetic reason and moral progress, as she was of the Romantic age, with its corresponding stress on the creative sympathies engendered by friendship, solitude, and the creative ego. An interlacing of these qualities is evident in male Romantic period tribute writing to Mary, and in the following two sections of this paper, I examine some of those tributes, looking at the prose writings from Lamb's literary friends, as well as tribute verses penned by Charles Lamb and Wordsworth, observing their constant emphasis on Mary's mild and calm disposition. It is likely, as Jane Eyre and among other modern critics have argued, that Mary subjected herself to a lifetime of repression to succeed in appearing thus calm. It is equally probable that male admirers emphasized her tranquil demeanor as a mark of her conventional femininity and as a way of dispelling her legacy of violent madness. While Mary's mental illness and her crime of matricide, the tragedy or awful act, as it was euphemistically called, was an open secret among the literary men and women in the Lamb's inner circle, who knew her primarily in her role of devoted sister and hostess at the Thursday evenings held at the Lamb's home. So while all of that was an open secret, and it was and that version of Mary was familiar to them, it's also the case, of course, that it's in that domestic role that Mary is incarnated in the role of Bridget in Lamb's Essays of Elia, of whom John Clare, an interesting figure in the context of any discussion of madness, scribbled in manuscript in 1824. And there is his sister Bridget, a good sort of woman. Out of this reputation emerged many tributes to Mary's perceived gentleness, her loving kindness, her intuitive sympathy, her quiet domesticity, her rational powers of mind as an author and poet, and her calmness. To be called Lamb, of course, is to invite taxonomic metaphoricity, and Charles also had some of that, of course, as per Coleridge's My Gentle-Hearted Lamb in his poem, This Lime Tree Bower My Prison. And here we have Charles and Mary together in the only well-known portrait, maybe even the only portrait of them, painted in 1834, the year of Charles Lamb's death, of course, when he was 59, and Mary was 70, though I don't know if that's her hair or whether it's an extension of her hat. It looks rather like hair. It's improbably dark anyway for a woman of 70 years of age. And I think it's a dreadful portrait. Of course, it does neither of them any favors. According to the artist, according to the artist's son, pardon me, according to the artist F.S. Carey, son of Lamb's friend Henry Francis Carey, it was painted entirely from life at my studio in Hart Street, Bloomsbury, with one or other of the Lambs sitting every Thursday throughout the summer of 1834. Mary's headgear is, I kind of think, enough to drive anyone insane. But anyway, here she is, the picture of calmness. Perhaps the awfulness, the largeness of the hat is meant to cover up any hint of feminine madness and emphasize instead her intellect. I'm not sure, but here she is portrayed with Charles at a shared writing desk. And it is Mary's powers of mind, as well as her kindness, that friends of the Lamb remember. Flowery encomiums flowed freely from the pen of Coleridge, Lamb's schoolmate from his days at Christ's Hospital. As early as December 1794, in the years before the tragedy, Coleridge had remarked of Mary, "Her mind is elegantly stored, her heart feeling." Neither did Coleridge change his loving opinions of her subsequently. In December 1796, he wrote to the publisher Benjamin Flower, "The young lady who in a fit of frenzy killed her own mother was the sister of my dearest friend, and herself dear to me as an only sister." On her authorship of books for children, Coleridge claimed that Mrs. Leicester's school ranked alongside Robinson Crusoe in its entitlement to posterity. "It at once soothes and amuses me to think, nay, to know, that the time will come when this little volume of my dear and well-nigh oldest friend Mary Lamb will not only be enjoyed, but acknowledged as a rich jewel in the treasury of our permanent English literature." Certainly, his hopes for that volume have not yet been fulfilled, and it seems plain, given the vastly differing fortunes of Defoe and Mary Lamb, that Coleridge is guilty of rhetorical overstatement. Yet what is most striking, as one reviews the tributes to Lamb from her male contemporaries, is the generosity of their language about her. She is repeatedly and pointedly praised by her male admirers as a woman who stands alone of all her sex, not negatively, on account of the awful act, but highly positively, notably for her mutually reinforcing qualities of reason and kindness. Another admirer was William Hazlitt, that great portrait essayist of the Romantic age, notorious for his prickly appraisals of contemporary male figures, although he made an exception for Charles Lamb, as he would also do for Mary. While by his own account, he thought the majority of women incapable of rational thought, Hazlitt excluded Mary from their number. Thomas Noon Talfourd, the 19th century memoirist, records Hazlitt saying that he had never met with a woman who could reason, and had met with one only thoroughly reasonable, the sole exception being Mary Lamb. Thomas de Quincey, that other famous essayist of the Romantic period, referred admiringly to Mary's winning goodness, to her talents and sweetness of disposition. He credits her with preventing the escalation of a literary disagreement that occurred on his first meeting with her brother over the merit of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. De Quincey, then an eager undergraduate with an enthusiasm for Coleridge that, in his words, had all the sanctity of religion and all the tenderness of a human veneration, was subjected to Lamb's teasing wit, for which he was ill prepared. By his own account, De Quincey reacted with almost involuntary rudeness to Lamb's ferocious canon of judgment, which seemed to question the value of the entire poem, provoking the following exchange. So I have to read this because it's so good, even if slightly off topic. And my husband, John Strachan, says that he read this exact quotation when he gave the toast at last year's birthday lunch, but I've absolutely forgotten this. Great minds think alike, double singleness and all that. Anyway, here is De Quincey. "What instance could you bring from the poem that would bear you out in these insinuations?" "Instances," said Lamb. "Oh, I'll instance you. Pray, what do you say to this? The many men so beautiful, and they all dead did lie." So beautiful, indeed beautiful. Just think of such a gang of whopping vagabonds, all covered with pitch and chewing tobacco. And the old gentleman himself, what do you call him? The bright-eyed fellow? Returning to Mary, De Quincey calls her that Madonna-like lady in homage to Charles's view of one who fulfilled all the offices of tenderness and duty, and making up to him in her single character of sister all that he had lost of maternal kindness, all that for her sake he had forborne to seek of affections, conjugal or filial. De Quincey also recalls having read in his student days at Oxford Miss Lamb's pretty high-born Helen, The reference is to Mary Lamb's ballad, Helen Repentant Too Late, which is a gentle satire on Lamb's fondness for the portrait of a lady that had hung in their childhood home. Lamb thought the poem good enough to show Coleridge in 1800, and he subsequently printed the verses in his drama volume, John Woodville, in 1802, as an indication of esteem for his sister's poetical talent. So like her brother Charles, Mary was not without wit. Indeed, her adoption of the pseudonym Sempronia for her article on needlework testifies as such. Yet when Leigh Hunt, in his favourable review in the Examiner in 1819 of the works of Charles Lamb, turns his attention to Mary, remarking on the family likeness in their turn of her genius, he emphasises the sympathy she shared with Charles, not her wit, nor the fine line in ironic understatement, which one finds threaded through the stories and poems in Mrs. Leicester's school. His review closes indeed with a reference to Mary's goodness. Mr. Lamb, says Hunt, has addressed a sonnet to his sister, full of charming deference and gratitude. So I'm going to examine Lamb's sonnet writing a little later. First, I want to debate a proposition made by modern scholarship on Mary Lamb, which is the idea of there being a conspiracy of silence until her death in 1847 around the violence of her madness and her matricidal act. Catherine Anthony's joint biography, The Lambs, published in 1948, reflects that the silence was sustained for so long that it almost causes a shock to find John Hollingshead saying in his memoirs in 1895 that Mary murdered her mother. Hollingsworth was a journalist and a sketch writer with a family connection to the Lambs, and he too was a great admirer of Mary Lamb, and coincidentally is the subject of an excellent article by Ailey Innes in the latest issue of the Bulletin. Another recent Lamb critic, Bonnie Woodbury, observes in her fine essay, The Mad Body as the Text of Culture in the Writings of Charles Lamb, published in Studies in English Literature in 1999, that out of this silence developed the idealized portrait of Lamb as the most reasonable of women who, by a temper more placid, a spirit of enjoyment more serene than her brother's, guided him and protected him with her almost legendary practical mind. So why this special pleading for Lamb? Sympathy and common sense together would answer that the person who commits an act of murder, if we want to describe Mary that way, as a murderer, is, like so many other people, a complex personality whose diverse facets cannot be reduced to a single defining quality. In which respect, murderers are to some extent people like ourselves. Mary Lamb entertained at home. She wrote books for children and sympathetic letters to her close female friends, Dorothy Wordsworth and Hazlitt's future wife, Sarah Stoddart, offering sensible advice on emotional issues. One is reminded of Charles Lamb's sympathetic musings on the figure of the murderer in his article of 1810 to Leigh Hunt's Reflector on the danger of confounding moral with personal deformity, which warns against the mistake of supposing a murderer to resemble the stock character familiar to us from fairy tales, and of collapsing a many-faceted humanity into a single caricatured image. Who is there among us, says Lamb, that has known him before he committed the offence, that shall take upon him to say he can sit down coolly and pen a dispassionate description of a murderer? The tales of our nursery, the reading of our youth, the ill-looking man that was hired by the uncle to dispatch the children in the wood, the grim ruffians who smothered the babes in the tower, the black and beetle-browed assassin of Mrs. Ratcliffe, the shag-haired villain of Mr. Monk Lewis, the Tarquin tread and millstone-dropping eyes of murder in Shakespeare, the exaggerations of picture and of poetry, what we have read and what we have dreamed of, rise up and crowd in upon us such eye-scaring portraits of the man of blood that our pen is absolutely forestalled. In place of eye-scaring portraits of the man of blood, we have Mary, And it was Mary, acting on sympathy for Sarah Coleridge's neglect by her husband on his return from Malta in August 1806, and not having had word from him by mid-September, who sent Coleridge a stiff letter telling him, "You must positively write to Mrs. Coleridge this day, and you must write here that I may know you write, or you must come and dictate a letter for me to write to her." It seems plain that friends and family work together to protect their loved ones and themselves from calumny, and this certainly happened in the case of Mary Lamb. Even so, modern criticism has stressed the gendered element of the silence surrounding Lamb's act, arguing that it is intertwined with the social construction of madness and femininity in the 19th century that associated women with hysteria and other nervous diseases because of their reproductive biology, under which cover the possibility of violent female madness was submerged. Woodbury reads Lamb's works for children, especially Mrs. Leicester's School, as evidence of Mary Lamb's, and I'm quoting, interpolation into the medical and social discourses of her age. She locates signs of Lamb's dissociated self, the mad, dangerous body, and the docile body, on the one hand mad, on the other female, in the narrative interplay between daughters and other marginalized children and threatening or rejecting mothers in Mrs. Leicester's School. I think this is a case of the return of the repressed. Adriana Cracoon's Fatal Women of Romanticism, published in 2003, gives Lamb a starring role as the representative of repressed female violence. Cracoon uses a Fuseli drawing that I showed earlier for her book cover, and it's very striking. And it's a great book too. Cracoon interprets the first tale from Mrs. Leicester's School as a demonstration of women's undeniable participation in the symbolic order of language and culture, the violence of the letter in Lacanian terms, as well as in empirical violence. She argues that modern accounts which overlook this violence ironically do violence to Lamb's work, and by extension to Romantic period women's writing, by imposing onto it a teleological model of the moral progress of female and feminist benevolence. Cracoon is probably right about this, and it seems to me that she is also correct in her assertion, and I quote, that Mary Lamb presents an intriguing set of problems for feminist scholarship because she embodies irreconcilable qualities of violence and gentleness, assertiveness and self-effacement, and because these irreconcilable differences she embodies are directly related to writing. But how did Mary's men, so to speak, Lamb's brother and Lamb's poetic friends, notably Wordsworth and Coleridge, square, or at least do their best to square, that circle? In the final section of my paper, I want to turn to examples by Lamb and Wordsworth of tribute verse to Mary, not so as to find evidence, as it were, of a male or even a feminist conspiracy to cover up female violence, as per Cracoon's thesis, but rather to examine hierarchies of subject position and power that structure the I-thou forms of tribute poetry. There are examples of tribute poetry from Lamb and Wordsworth that position the male poetic voice as discreet, self-absorbed, egotistical. In such cases, the woman's identity is assumed by grammar and syntax into his poetics. And we'll see something of this in Lamb's first sonnet to my sister, published in 1796. There are other poems of Lamb's, however, where his ego is marked by permeability and fluidity that is conventionally associated with a more feminine subject position, as per his slightly later sonnet, also to Mary, entitled Sonnet to My Sister, published in 1797 in the second edition of Poems, containing work by Coleridge, Lamb, and Charles Lloyd. Equally, there are examples of tribute poems of the period to men by women poets, where the female voice appropriates the male, as in Felicia Hemons's To Wordsworth, published in the Literary Magnet in 1826. Hemons's triumph is to make Wordsworth come alive through her own voice, which is reinforced and expanded in the process. While she does not as easily presume an equality or poetic kinship with Wordsworth, of the type found, for example, in Percy Bysshe Shelley's 1816 sonnet to Wordsworth, which sees the younger poet both respecting and criticizing his elder, her poem nevertheless marks a disruption of the gender binary of male privilege and female submission. Tribute poetry might be said to lie at the heart of male romanticism. William Wordsworth, of course, referred to his long autobiographical poem as the poem to Coleridge, though his widow Mary, when she put it to press, gave it the title of The Prelude. It's a poem that demands to be read simultaneously as a self-reflexive monologue and as a dialectic or conversation between Wordsworth and his dedicatee Coleridge. The Prelude is the ne plus ultra of high romanticism. Through the frame of the conversation poem, Wordsworth both claims himself and gifts himself to his friend Coleridge. Wordsworth referred to his and Coleridge's joint labours on his great poem, and we might see this as a manifestation of double singleness to match that of the Lambs. The term double singleness, indeed, does good work as an epithet for the tribute poem in its harnessing of the dynamic mode of exchange in tribute poetry between self-affirmation and affirmation of the other. There is always something of the look at me about the tribute poem, and the same might be said about the relation between self and other in friendship. Lamb writes about friendship in a letter to Robert Lloyd in August 1798, which is, of course, the publication year, appropriately enough, of Lyrical Ballads, the experimental volume written out of Wordsworth's and Coleridge's poetic friendship. There must always be something of self in friendship. We love our friend because he is like ourselves. Can consequences altogether unmixed and pure be reasonably expected from such a source? Say that you love a friend for his moral qualities. Is it not rather because those qualities resemble what you fancy you own? This then is not without danger. We love our friend because he is ours. So do we our money, our wit, our knowledge, our virtue, and whenever this sense of appropriation and property enters, so much is to be subtracted from the value of that friendship or virtue. Lamb's dedication to Mary in his first published volume, Poems, 1796, addresses her as the author's best friend and sister. To My Sister was composed during the 6 weeks between December 1795 and the New Year that Lamb spent very agreeably, he said, in a madhouse at Hoxton, owing to a temporary attack of insanity, the only one he's known to have suffered, and which he attributed to his youthful, unreciprocated passion for Anne Simmons. In a letter dated the 27th of May, 1796, the earliest of Lamb's to survive, Lamb sent the sonnet to Coleridge for his approval, and it was printed in Poems that year. Mary thus stands with Charles at the very start of his published career as a poet. To My Sister, composed before Mary's act of matricide in September 1796, is an expression of atonement, Charles says in the poem, for some unkind words to her. If from my lips some angry accents fell, peevish complaint, or harsh reproof unkind, 'twas but the error of a sickly mind, and troubled thoughts, clouding the purer well and waters clear of reason. And for me let this my verse the poor atonement be, my verse which thou to praise wast ever inclined too highly, and with a partial eye to see no blemish. Thou to me didst ever show fondest affection, and wouldst oft times lend an ear to the desponding lovesick lay, weeping my sorrows with me, who repay but ill the mighty debt of love I owe, Mary, to thee, my sister and my friend. This loose Petrarchan sonnet is both a sincere apology from a brother to his sister, which is after all the poem's raison d'etre, and a self-absorbed preoccupation by Charles with his poetic worth. There is no conflict here. Charles is acknowledging his debt to Mary for giving him the reassurance he needs, but that his poems by his own account might not deserve. Of course, it is a dead metaphor, but debt is an interesting choice of word in the context of the financial element of tribute poems and their complex emotional transaction. Getting the same level of praise for different qualities is like the art of mutual compliment today, and the question it raises of how to return the grace back to the person who has praised you. The error of sickly mind and troubled thoughts for which Charles seeks atonement with his verse lead into a chain of personal and possessive pronouns, I, my, me, positioning him as principal actant in a rehearsal perhaps of the role he was to play in his life with Mary after their mother's death. That a poem advertised as a tribute to a woman is no less concerned with the poetic doubts and preoccupations of its male author is characteristic of the I-thou dynamic of the genre of tribute and friendship poetry. As Lamb somewhat regretfully acknowledges in his letter to Lloyd, there must always be something of self in friendship. We love our friend because he is like ourselves. Lamb's early poetry, published between the years 1796 to 97, is often about love, as indeed was Wordsworth's before him. As Duncan has written, most of Wordsworth's extant poetry from the years 1776 to 87 is about love, as if he needed either to define or convince himself of its existence. Maybe something similar can be said of Lamb. At the very least, we know Lamb asked Coleridge for the title page to his contribution to the second edition of poems to read Chiefly Love Sonnets by Charles Lamb of the India House. To My Sister is a love poem of a sort. It demonstrates Lamb's belief, as stated in his letter to Lloyd, that the object of affection is dear to us, at least in part, because she or he resembles that which we fancy ourselves to be. This is more benevolent than it may seem. To My Sister is the creation of a double singleness. Mary is both enfolded into the compass of Charles's being, weeping my sorrows with me in line 12, and given a separate identity. The emphatic apostrophe that concludes the sestet emphasizes the singularity of her name, Mary, and expands it into the plural identities of sister and friend. In January 1797, 5 months after Mary had had the verdict of lunacy delivered upon her by the jury at her mother's inquest, Charles Lamb wrote to Coleridge with a second sonnet addressed to Mary, with a request to print it next after my other sonnet to my sister. Lamb described this sonnet as an expression of fraternal sentiment, which he said to Coleridge might atone for the total want of anything like merit or genius in it. Perhaps Coleridge agreed with Lamb on the issue of the poem's merit or lack of it, since he didn't include it in the 1797 volume, and it later appeared separately with the alternative title Sonnet to a Friend in the monthly magazine in October 1797. Friend of my earliest years and childish days, my joys, my sorrows, thou with me hast shared, companion dear, and we alike have fared, poor pilgrims we, through life's unequal ways. It were unwisely done, should we refuse to cheer our path as featly as we may, our lonely path to cheer, as travellers use with merry song, quaint tale, or roundelay. And we will sometimes talk past troubles of mercy shown and all our sickness healed, and in his judgments, God remembering love. And we will learn to praise God evermore for those glad tidings of great joy revealed by that sooth messenger sent from above. This sonnet has a more open emotional dynamic than its Petrarchan predecessor. In its religious register, it possesses something of the language of spiritual benevolence found in Coleridge's early conversation poems. The apostrophe to my friend In the opening line, Mary is unnamed here, presumably out of a respect for her anonymity, perhaps following the inquest on her mother's death, leads into the exposition of a steadfast pilgrim-like love between two people. Plural pronouns predominate, making the whole appear more reciprocal and less driven by a single look at me ego than the earlier tribute poem. Weak though the poetry may be, the emotion is pure. The only true cement of a valuable friendship, the only thing that makes it not sinful, Lamb wrote to Lloyd in his letter of August 1798, is when two friends propose to become mutually of benefit to each other in a moral or religious way. Sonnet to My Sister is Lamb's poetical enactment of that aim. Lamb died in middle age, as we know, aged 59 in December 1835. Wordsworth's well-known tribute verse, written on the death of Charles Lamb, composed in 1835, which opens with, "To a good man of most dear memory," expands into 131 lines of blank verse elegy. For 62 of those lines, the focus is on Charles Lamb. At line 63, however, almost at its exact midpoint, Wordsworth turns his attention to Mary. The shift in focus marks a bifurcation such that the poem's two halves that at once split and join the whole replicate the double singleness which Charles attributed to himself and Mary. Line 63 introduces the sororal relationship of brother and sister. A sister 'tis a word timidly uttered, for she lives the meek, the self-restraining, and the ever-kind, in whom thy reason and intelligent heart found for all interests, hopes, and tender cares, all softening, humanizing, hallowed powers, whether withheld or for her sake unsought, more than sufficient recompense. Sufficient recompense is a near echo of the phrase abundant recompense used by Wordsworth in Tintern Abbey to address what he has lost since the hour of thoughtless youth and what his reason and intelligent heart have found in his sister Dorothy. My dear, dear friend, and in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. Oh, yet a little while, may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister. The poet's relationship with Dorothy is mirrored in his verses to Lamb, which describe Lamb and Mary as a double tree with two collateral stems sprung from one root. A vocabulary of identicalness, which is even stronger than that of the reciprocity characterizing Dorothy and William's relationship, is Wordsworth's tribute to the bond between Charles and Mary Lamb, and indeed that to Mary herself. Okay, let's see. End of my slideshow. Thank you.